And among the largest of them, we find skulls 60% heavier than normal human skulls and a brain capacity that is 2.5 times larger than the normal human brain.
Scientists finally reconstructed the faces of the 3,000-year-old Paracas people, and the results were unsettling. These individuals, with their bizarrely elongated skulls, have been a source of mystery since they were discovered nearly a century ago.
Some initial DNA testing has been done, and the results, according to the geneticist, are quite startling. There were certain segments of the DNA that didn't match anything known to be human.
The official story has always been that their strange head shape was the result of a cultural ritual. But the thing nobody tells you is that the anatomy doesn't quite add up, and recent genetic testing has thrown everything we thought we knew into chaos, pointing to an origin that is simply not from the Americas. What the DNA actually revealed? For years, a handful of researchers and independent observers kept pointing out details about the Paracas that didn't quite fit. But their concerns were mostly ignored until the 21st century brought a tool that could answer questions no one had dared to ask seriously before: DNA analysis. Brian Forster, a researcher who has spent years investigating the skulls, commissioned a series of genetic tests on samples taken from the skulls. What came back was nothing short of a bombshell. The initial results, released in 2014, suggested the skulls contained mitochondrial DNA, with mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal known so far. To put it mildly, this was an explosive claim, but it got even stranger. Further testing on different skulls reportedly found something that, if true, could rewrite human history. The DNA didn't match the genetic profile of Native Americans. Instead, some of the samples had haplogroups, genetic markers passed down through generations, that were most commonly found in people from Europe and the Middle East. This discovery was a massive wrench in the gears of the accepted timeline of history. How could a group of people in Peru, 3,000 years ago, have DNA from the other side of the world, long before Columbus or even the Vikings made their journey? These were not peer-reviewed academic studies. The geneticists involved often remained anonymous, and the results were announced through online videos and conferences rather than in scientific journals. This led mainstream archaeologists and geneticists to dismiss the findings outright. They argued that the samples were almost certainly contaminated. Ancient DNA is incredibly fragile. A single skin cell or hair from a modern person handling the remains could completely corrupt the sample, making it look like the skull had European ancestry when it was really just the ancestry of the last person who touched it. It's an easy mistake to make if you're not using the hyper-sterile, controlled environments required for ancient DNA work. Despite the skepticism from the mainstream, the DNA bombshell had already been dropped, and it created a clear divide. On one side, you had established science, which stood by the cranial deformation theory, and dismissed the DNA results as flawed. On the other, you had a growing number of people who believed the skulls were evidence of a lost branch of humanity, an ancient migration that history forgot, or something even more mysterious. The DNA didn't provide a clean answer. Instead, it turned a fascinating anthropological curiosity into one of the most heated and controversial mysteries in the world. It raised the stakes and made everyone look at the skulls in a new light. The skulls were no longer just oddly shaped bones. They were a profound genetic puzzle. A closer look at the skulls. Long before DNA entered the picture, it was the physical anatomy of the Paracas skulls that first raised red flags. Believers in the standard head-binding theory had to ignore some seriously inconvenient facts. You see, while binding a child's head can change its shape, it can't change its volume. You're just squishing the same amount of material into a different form. Think of it like taking a ball of clay and rolling it into a long snake. The shape is different, but the amount of clay is identical. But the Paracas skulls are different. Their cranial volume is, on average, up to 25% larger than that of a conventional human skull. Some of them are also up to 60% heavier. That isn't something that can be explained by binding. You can't just add more brain matter and bone density by wrapping a baby's head in cloth. This massive cranial capacity is the single most challenging piece of evidence for the mainstream theory. Where did all that extra space come from? For this reason alone, many researchers felt that something else had to be going on. But that wasn't the only anatomical puzzle. There were the subtle but significant structural differences too. For instance, a normal human skull has a dividing line, a suture, running down the top of the skull called the sagittal suture. Many of the Paracas skulls are missing this feature. The bone plate is smooth and uninterrupted. While it's possible for this to happen as a rare birth defect, finding it in so many individuals from the same community is highly unusual and suggests a shared genetic trait. Then there is the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord connects. In the Paracas skulls, this opening is often positioned further back and is smaller than in typical human skulls. The jaw is also often more robust, and the eye sockets are larger and shaped differently. When you start adding up all these little details, the larger volume, the missing suture, the different placement of the foramen magnum, the bigger eye sockets, it paints a picture of a group of people who were anatomically distinct from their neighbors. The differences weren't just cosmetic, they were structural. These anatomical quirks are precisely why the mystery has persisted for so long. It's easy to look at one of these skulls and just say, head binding. But it's much harder to maintain that position when confronted with a whole list of features that the practice simply cannot account for. This is what pushed researchers like Brian Furster to seek out genetic testing in the first place. He reasoned that if the differences were truly genetic, then the DNA would have to be different too. It turns out that he may have been right, just not in the way anyone expected. The bones themselves were telling a story of a people who were physically different, but nobody was truly prepared for what they would look like. And so, scientists decided to put a face to these mysterious bones, bringing the ancients to life. For years, the Paracas skulls were just anatomical specimens, objects of scientific curiosity displayed behind glass. But what if you could see the person behind the skull? Using a combination of forensic science and artistic skill, researchers set out to do just that. They decided to reconstruct the faces of the Paracas people, and the results were far more disturbing than the bones themselves. The process of facial reconstruction is a meticulous one. It starts with a three-dimensional laser scan of the skull to create a perfect digital replica. From there, forensic artists use established data on tissue depth at various points on the human face to digitally apply muscle, fat, and skin, layer by layer. But here's the thing. All of that data is based on conventional human skulls. The artists working on the Paracas skulls had to adapt their methods to account for the extreme elongation. The final images they produced are truly uncanny. The faces that emerged are recognizably human, but at the same time, they are deeply alien. They have incredibly high, sloping foreheads that stretch far back, and their faces are long and narrow. Their eyes, set in those larger than normal sockets, appear wide and almost cat-like, while their cheekbones are high and pronounced. Their jawlines are strong, but their chins are often delicate and pointed. The overall effect is unsettling, to say the least. They don't look like any modern human population. When you look at these reconstructions, the term head binding starts to feel woefully inadequate. You get the distinct impression that you are looking at a different type of human. The images went viral almost immediately. They spread across the internet and appeared in documentaries, fueling a new wave of speculation. For those who already believed the skulls were not normal, these faces were the ultimate proof. They argued that no amount of cultural modification could produce a face so fundamentally different. Of course, skeptics were quick to point out that facial reconstruction is part science and part art. An artist has to make choices about things like skin tone, eye color, and the shape of the nose and lips, which can't be known for sure from the skull alone. It's possible that the reconstructions were intentionally made to look more dramatic or strange. But even with that caveat, the underlying bone structure is real. The high forehead, the long face, and the large eyes are all dictated by the shape of the skull itself. The reconstructions gave a face to the mystery, and that face was not entirely familiar. It was a haunting reminder that we still know very little about these ancient people. But what does all of this actually mean for our understanding of human history? Tying it all together. We have a story with two competing narratives, and the evidence is just strange enough to keep both of them alive. On one hand, we have the mainstream scientific explanation. The skulls are the result of an extreme and highly skilled form of artificial cranial deformation, practiced by an elite group within the Paracas culture. In this view, the anatomical oddities are likely exaggerated, and the DNA results are simply the product of contamination. It's a clean, simple explanation that keeps everything within the known boundaries of human history and biology. It's comfortable, but on the other hand, that comfortable explanation leaves a lot of nagging questions unanswered. This is where people watching this, people looking for a mystery, start to wonder if we're missing a key detail. If it was just head binding, why is the cranial volume so much larger? Why do so many skulls lack the sagittal suture? And how do you explain the foramen magnum being in a different position? The sheer number of anomalies makes it hard to just sweep them all under the rug of cultural practice. The thing is, when you combine these physical puzzles with the controversial DNA findings and the deeply unsettling facial reconstructions, you get a mystery that is impossible to ignore. This has led to a range of alternative theories. Some propose that the Paracas were a separate subspecies of human, a Homo sapiens Paracas, that lived alongside us and eventually disappeared. This would account for the consistent genetic differences. Others suggest they were the descendants of a much older, lost civilization that migrated to Peru thousands of years ago, which could explain the foreign DNA. And of course, there's the ancient astronaut theory, which posits that the elongated skulls are a sign of extraterrestrial genetic manipulation, or that the Paracas were trying to emulate the appearance of otherworldly visitors. The bottom line is, we simply don't know for sure. The Paracas mystery stands as a perfect example of how science operates at its very edges, where curiosity, uncertainty, and speculation all collide. We're dealing with a collection of artifacts that refuse to fit neatly into our current understanding of human history. These elongated skulls, with their strange shapes and unusual cranial volumes, seem to whisper a story that we haven't yet learned to translate. Over the years, researchers, skeptics, and believers alike have tried to make sense of them. Some see clear evidence of deliberate cranial deformation, a practice well documented across ancient cultures. Others argue that certain skulls go beyond what could be achieved by binding alone, that their internal structures, bone thickness, and cranial sutures point to something different, something possibly unknown. The debate continues to divide scientists and fringe theorists, each camp convinced they hold the truth. For now, these skulls exist in a kind of scientific limbo, caught between possibility and proof. What's desperately needed are rigorous, transparent, peer-reviewed DNA studies, using uncontaminated samples and modern sequencing methods. Only then can we hope to uncover whether these remains truly belonged to an isolated human lineage, a cultural anomaly, or something even stranger. Until that day comes, the Paracas people will remain what they have always been, a haunting question carved in bone. They stare back at us from across a gulf of 3,000 years, daring us to explain them, daring us to admit how much of the ancient world we still don't understand. And maybe that's the real message of the Paracas mystery, that for all our science and progress, there are still corners of human history that refuse to be neatly solved. So, what do you think? Are the skulls a lost human lineage or just a cultural quirk? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more answers to ancient mysteries.